Hey everybody, this is JDGaming back today with another episode of Get Better at Yu-Gi-Oh! So today's episode we're talking about the chain, both the basic aspects of how it's built, but then also some intricacies as to how you may miss timing or just straight up miss the opportunity to introduce one of your effects into the chain. By going through some of these details, the hope is that you'll be able to make the most out of building it and get the best advantage possible. So this is another episode that is suggested by subscriber Mike Tuttle, so shout out to you. Hopefully this will help you guys step up your game. As usual, we begin with a definition. A chain is Yu-Gi-Oh's version of a queue, or pretty much any list of things that should happen in-game at the same time. But because this is a turn-based game, we can't just have effects resolve simultaneously. It'd be chaos. We're not basing Yu-Gi-Oh! Resolutions based on how fast one player is than the other physically. So what ends up happening is there's a system for when you would put cards in order on this chain, which is an imaginary ladder of sorts, and then you would go and resolve them in a specific order, or follow through the card text. So imagine this scenario. You have two face downs, and your opponent has one. They're attacking you with their mighty Blackluster Soldier, and you decide to activate your Drowning Mirror Force. This Drowning Mirror Force activation is Chainlink 1 here. Your opponent can then try and activate Trap Stun as Chainlink 2. And in that instance, if you decide to then play your Wiretap, that would be Chainlink 3. So you have 1, 2, and 3 built up. If neither player wants to add any more effects to this chain, the basic rule is you go and resolve things backwards. Start with Chainlink 3, read through the text, and it says when a trap's activated, which is when you played it, negate the activation, and if you do, shuffle it into the deck. So Trap Stun is now negated, and it's shuffled away. We go to Chainlink 2, but because it's been negated by Wiretap, its effect fizzles out, and Chainlink 2 is done resolving with no effect. Then we go to Chainlink 1 here, and if we read the text that says spin BLS back to the deck, that's what ends up happening. Now, we're not going to go over the intricacies of why on earth didn't this Trap Stun player play their trap before they attacked into 2 back row in one go, because that's a completely different thing altogether. But hopefully this illustrates the basic idea of a chain. You build up 1, 2, 3, and then you read them backwards, because otherwise, if you had your Mirror Force resolve first, it wouldn't make sense, because no one would play other cards on top of that if you couldn't actually respond to it before it went through. So what things go on a chain and what things don't? Well, there are some actions in this game that I call inherent actions, and these don't actually get any chain link number. And that sometimes matters because cards may care about chain link number, or they may actually say something about the chain. If you normal summon any monster like Curry Bandit, that normal summon is an action that's just part of the game that does not take any chain link into account. If you decided to activate this card's effect later, that would be an effect that activates, and it would be Chainlink 1. Another action that does not take any chains into account is the inherent summon. Cards like Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, and Cyber Dragon are classic monsters, and their updated texts, not these particular versions, will actually have in parentheses from your hand or from wherever they are summoned, and that tells you that you're not able to introduce a chainable trap that says something about a chain or an effect. These are not effects that summon, so you could not activate something like Divine Wrath in response to their summon. Interestingly, the new Solemn Strike trap card completely goes around that issue by not only stopping monster effects that activate, things like Gores if you will, but also has the ability to swallow up the inherent summons, and that's why it's so powerful, and that's why it's written that way. It's not redundant, it actually covers 2 different types of summons. Anytime you have the summon of a monster that's from your extra deck, that's a Synchro or an Xyz monster, and it's not written on the card what you do, will be an inherent summon. So if you go and just summon a generic Synchro like Stardust Dragon, that's an inherent summon. If you look at a Cyber Dragon Infinity, it says you can also summon this from your extra deck using this as materials, and that would count as an inherent effect because there's no colon in the new problem-solving card text. Usually you'll be able to read on newer cards if you have a colon, it's an effect that happens, and that's something that can only be stopped by something like Divine Wrath, Solemn Strike, etc. Whereas if it doesn't have the colon and instead tells you from whatever location in parentheses, that will be an inherent summon that does not begin a chain. We briefly talked about how normal summoning Curry Bandit doesn't actually cause a chain to begin, but its effect activation, paying the cost and sending it to the graveyard, would then cause it to be Chain Link 1. Similarly, if we have these two monsters that we've inherently summoned, they won't start a chain, but you can activate their effects and that would add on to whatever chain does exist. Now let's take a brief moment and talk about spell speeds. So speed in this game has to do with whether or not you're allowed to activate something. When I go ahead and activate Curry Bandit, it's an ignition effect. That means in an open game state during my turn when I have nothing else to resolve and my opponent has nothing else to resolve, I can go ahead and say, I activate Curry Bandit's effect, send him to the grave, and follow the card text. And that's similar to having a spell card, a normal spell like Allure of Darkness, where I can't just activate this as a chain to my opponent's actions or on top of any one of my own actions. This has to be the thing I start my move with out of nowhere. However, if you look at cards like Stardust Dragon and Infinity, they actually have effects that chain on top of things. And so these are faster effects. These quick effects, trigger effects, whatever the card effect may be, are spell speed 2 because they have the ability to respond to any other spell speed 2 or spell speed 1. And other cards of that category would be things like quick play spells or any form of trap card excluding counter traps. So we'll put this for a second here because we're going to get to that. Spell speed 3 is at the top of this hierarchy, and a card like Wiretap or Solemn Strike can only be responded to by other counter traps. And that's really powerful because that means if you play Wiretap to stop that Drowning Mirror Force, the trap stun cannot be played in response to it because its spell speed 2 is too slow. Again, in the previous example, you could preemptively flip up trap stun, but that's a different story altogether in how you should be playing your cards. Now that we've covered the very basics of chains, it's time to cover the concept of missing the timing. This is a special phrase in this game that refers to any time you're no longer able to activate a card's effect, even though it looks like it has been triggered. Very famous examples of this would be the Hands and Elemental Hero the Shining. All these guys have effects that say when they're destroyed, you can do whatever, or when they're sent to the grave, you can do whatever. That's the key phrase. When you can means that the effect that happens for these cards has to happen simultaneously at the same time as the trigger. And so the hands would have to be destroyed and nothing else can happen in between before they're allowed to use their summoning effects. For the Shining, you'd have to have it be sent to the graveyard and nothing else has to happen within that same chain link before you can go and summon or return back your other two heroes. And that's the same case with Yang Zings nowadays as well. They say when they're destroyed, you can go and summon another similar monster. What does that mean? It means you can take advantage of that by using monsters that have multiple effects. Take, for example, the classic Raikou. The original card text says, flip, you can destroy one card on the field. Send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. And that looks a bit ambiguous, but looking at an updated version of the card that has updated problem-solving card text tells you, flip, you can target one card on the field, semicolon. Destroy that target, if any. Also after that, in the same chain link, send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. So because the destruction happens and then to continue resolving this effect, you mill the 3 cards off the top, you could destroy any one of these monsters and they would not be able to get their optional trigger effect because the destruction has already passed by the time you're done resolving that mill 3. And it's a similar case with Soul Taker. Whether you look at an updated or an old version, it says destroy a face-up monster your opponent controls, then your opponent gains 1,000 life points. That then your opponent gains 1,000 life can actually be more of a handicap to them because it will force them to miss timing on monsters that have optional triggers. Interestingly enough, even the hands themselves happen to have effects that read, you can target a spell or trap or monster they control. Destroy that target, then you can special summon the other hand from your deck. And that actually means you can go and make your opponent's monsters miss timing because these things also have a destruction effect followed by the optional summon, which makes it so that your opponent's destroyed card was not destroyed as the last action. Something interrupted between your opponent's guy being destroyed, which is the trigger, and when they would be allowed to go and resolve. And, as an FYI, that's also why the new 9 Pillars of the Yang Zing is worded in this specific way. It says, when a spell or trap card or monster effect's activated, you control a Yang Zing, negate the activation, and if you do shuffle the card into the deck, then destroy one other Yang Zing you control. Because the destruction is the very last thing to happen, nothing else, at least with just Yang Zing here, would go and interfere with the Yang Zing monsters, and then you would be able to go and trigger their effects to summon. As if Yu-Gi-Oh! Weren't complicated enough, that's not the only way you can miss timing on your monsters. Although that's kind of an official term that says missing the timing happens when you have a win you can't affect, there's another way you can miss out on your important monster effects. Here, let's say I'm playing a Frog Monarch deck, and I have Caius on the board along with a Formula Synchron. So that's 8 stars on the board. If my opponent decides to activate Dark Hole, this is a spell card that activates as Chain Link 1. I can then activate my Chain Link 2 Formula Synchron, which will allow me to Synchro Summon. Let's say neither of us has anything else to contribute to the chain. Alright, we'll resolve backwards. Chain Link 2 Formula Synchron tunes Caius and allows me to summon Stardust Dragon. Unfortunately, that is Chain Link 2 that has just finished up. We must go to Chain Link 1 here. Dark Hole continues, wipes that Stardust Dragon right off the board. But what happened? Doesn't Stardust Dragon stop Dark Hole? Well, yes it does, but the problem is even though Stardust Dragon is a spell speed 2 monster with a quick effect that could, in general, negate Dark Hole, we are in the middle of a chain right now. So even if this monster exists, it can only activate its effect and try to respond to Dark Hole if it's on the field while the chain is still building. It's almost like, think of the chain as this big avalanche. Once it gets going, nothing's going to stop it. All of this is going to keep rolling down the hill until it's done resolving everything in the chain. At that point, Stardust Dragon gets caught in this giant avalanche, and it doesn't have a chance to activate its effect. So it doesn't matter if you chose to summon Stardust Spark Dragon either. Because this isn't a truly passive effect and must activate and resolve to protect it, or any other card, these monsters would be destroyed because they never get a chance to activate their effects. Interestingly, this also happens if we were to summon similar monsters. Black Rose Dragon says when it's Synchro Summoned, you can destroy all cards. Not only would you miss timing because it says when you can, and Dark Hole would wipe this off the board, but let's say you got rid of Dark Hole and you replace it for an Allure of Darkness. You go ahead and you play your Formula Synchron with a level 5 monster, summon Black Rose. Black Rose Dragon is still on the board once Chain Link 2's done and Chain Link 1's done. But now you didn't summon it just now. There was something in between, the resolution of Allure of Darkness. As a result, you missed the optional effect of you can destroy all cards on the field. And similarly, the mighty Trishul is not immune from this either, because it says when this card is Synchro Summoned, you can activate its terrifying power and banish 3 of your opponent's resources. You can miss timing if you go and Formula Synchron into these guys. So you gotta be really careful in how you build your chains, because if your monsters have optional triggers, or they never get a chance to activate their abilities, they may not be as useful to you in the middle of the chain, and you may want to activate your Formula Synchron preemptively. It's actually very interesting to note that certain cards have clarifying texts to tell you exactly how they work in a chain like this. Let's go back to the Dark Hole scenario here. If you have a Hyper Librarian on the board, it says, if a monster is Synchro Summoned. Oh great, the cool word here is if. If it says if, you will not miss timing on your effects. Simply resolve this effect in a new chain right after the first chain is done. Continuing to read, draw 1 card. This card must be face up on the field to activate and resolve this effect. So if I have a Hyper Librarian on the board, right, and then I go ahead and synchro using these 2. So let's say Chain Link 1, Chain Link 2 Formula Synchron. Well, right now, a monster hasn't been summoned, so nothing will happen here. I go and resolve Chain Link 2, bring out Stardust Dragon. Chain Link 1 wipes these guys off the board, right? So from the graveyard, oh yeah, Hyper Librarian says if, so it can't miss timing, right? Well, that's technically correct, but the clarifying text on here is that it must stay face up on the field. And since it's no longer on the board once Dark Hole has done its thing, we no longer have Hyper Librarian to activate its effect, which is very unfortunate. However, if you had a monster like Dandelion that says if it's sent to the graveyard you trigger and summon its 2 fluffs, then even in this scenario, if you have Chainlink 2 Stardust Dragon, Chainlink 1, or I guess Chainlink 2 a Formula Synchron, Chainlink 1 Dark Hole, kills everything. Once that chain's done, Dandelion would now be an activated Chainlink 1 that starts a new chain, and then you and your opponent could start building onto that mandatory trigger effect. Very, very complicated, I know, but try watching this video maybe a bit slower, maybe a couple times, and see if you can figure out exactly what's going on with this chain. It takes a while at first and a bit of practice to get used to seeing how these chains are built, but once you get the hang of it, it really gives you the chance to take advantage of card interactions and allows you to come out on top. And there you have it, a quick crash course into the workings of the chain, and then a couple ways that things may not go exactly as planned. Make sure you spend a moment to get this idea in your head, and you'll start to find that these mistakes don't happen quite as often, and you may even be able to force your opponent into these awkward scenarios instead. Down below in the description you will find the playlist for the rest of these Get Betters, so feel free to browse the rest of the collection we have so far. And if you have any suggestions on this episode or any other topics you'd like to see in the future, then I'd love to hear them down below as well. Thanks guys, this is JDGaming, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.